The war nurse. The mud of the Western Front clung to everything: boots, uniforms, and flesh alike. Clara Henderson trudged along the cratered field, her medical satchel heavy with supplies and dread. The air smelled of smoke and blood, a pungent, unrelenting reminder that the war had claimed more lives than maps and reports could ever reflect. Soldiers huddled in trenches, their faces pale, eyes hollow, shadows of the men they once were. Clara moved among them with quiet determination, offering bandages, water, and whispered words of reassurance, but even her practiced hands trembled at the sight of shattered limbs and the silence of those who could no longer speak. Night fell with a suddenness that was almost cruel. The sky darkened, thick clouds blotting out any semblance of starlight, while the distant thunder of artillery became a constant heartbeat, pounding against ears and bones. Clara rested momentarily in a ruined farmhouse, its walls scarred by shell fire, the air inside smelling faintly of rot and old smoke. She was alone, or so she believed. Shadows flitted across the walls, impossible in the dim candlelight, and for a fleeting moment she thought she saw faces, men she had tended in the past, standing silently, watching. She blinked, and they were gone, leaving only the chill of the draft and the echo of her own heartbeat. Later, in the field hospital tent, Clara worked tirelessly, stitching, bandaging, administering morphine to those whose pain was more than flesh-deep. Every groan, every whispered prayer seemed amplified in the silence between bombardments. And then came the whispers. Faint at first, like the rustle of leaves, but gradually clearer, the voices of men she had treated days, weeks ago, speaking in tones she could not mistake. "Clara, help us!" Her hands froze, scalpel hovering mid-air. The tent around her seemed to shift, elongating unnaturally, the canvas walls bending, pressing closer. She told herself it was exhaustion, hallucination born from endless nights and endless suffering. Yet, deep in her chest, a cold certainty grew. These were not mere echoes of memory. As the night deepened, the voices became persistent, overlapping in urgent, fragmented phrases. Soldiers long dead, faces she would never forget, stepped into the shadows, their eyes pleading, accusing, and haunting. Clara could feel them around her, as tangible as the cold mud beneath her knees, their presence pressing on her, shaping her reality. Every wound she had sown, every life she had touched, now seemed a link in a chain, binding her to the unseen and the unrelenting horror of war beyond the living. The line between past and present blurred. Were these men seeking comfort, revenge, or something more incomprehensible? Clara's breath hitched. She wanted to flee, but instinct, training, and fear kept her rooted. The candle flickered violently, casting grotesque shadows that danced across the tent walls. The whispers converged, forming words that chilled her marrow. "You cannot save us, and yet you must." A guttural, primal dread surged through her veins. For the first time, she understood that the battlefield had not only taken lives, it had left behind something that would not rest, and that the nurse who had tried to heal so many was now as vulnerable as any soldier exposed to the guns and the night. The sounds of artillery faded into a distant, rhythmic pulse, like a heartbeat separate from her own. Clara sat in tense silence, listening to the voices as they circled her, naming places, dates, moments she could not recall, moments she feared to remember. Somewhere between exhaustion and terror, she realized the whispers were not asking for aid, they were demanding acknowledgment. And as the candle guttered, shadows solidifying into forms more certain than flesh, Clara Henderson understood that the night had only just begun, and that the war was not over, not for her, and not for those who lingered between life and death. The candlelight quivered, casting the tent in shifting patterns that seemed almost alive. Clara's hands shook as she refilled bandages, each movement precise yet hesitant, aware that the shadows around her had begun to take on a presence of their own. The whispers returned, louder now, layered in tones both familiar and foreign. "Clara, turn, follow, save us!" The syllables twisted through the air, curling around her ears and sinking into her chest like icy fingers. Her mind raced, trying to reconcile the living with the dead, the present with memory, but every rational thought was overshadowed by the oppressive certainty that the soldiers she had tended were no longer confined to the earth. She stepped outside into the night, seeking the silence of the open field, hoping for fresh air to clear her mind. The mud clung to her boots, sucking at each step, as if the earth itself resisted her movement. And then she saw them, figures in tattered uniforms, their faces pale and etched with pain, standing beyond the reach of any firelight. Their eyes glowed faintly, unblinking, filled with a demand that transcended words. Clara's heart pounded. Instinct urged her to flee, but the weight of their gaze rooted her in place. Each figure bore the familiar scars of wounds she had dressed, the very marks of her hands, yet now they were twisted into a silent accusation. Inside the tent, other nurses had begun to whisper, noticing the same phenomena, beds creaking under invisible weight, equipment shifting, and, most haunting of all, the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching, though no one was there. Clara returned hurriedly, her breath sharp in the cold night air. The whispers intensified, overlapping into a chorus that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. "We are still here. You left us. You cannot save us. Yet you must." Each phrase resonated through her very bones, as if the dead were not merely speaking, but reshaping reality itself around her. She approached the stretchers, hands hovering over the pale, sleeping faces of soldiers wounded in the past hours. One of them, Thomas, murmured in his sleep, yet his lips did not move. A cold wind swept through the tent, snuffing the candlelight momentarily, and when it returned, Clara could have sworn she saw the figures from the field reflected in the canvas, lined up silently, watching, waiting. The air was thick with the scent of iron and decay, a tangible presence that clung to her skin and hair. Each heartbeat felt exaggerated, resonating in her skull, synchronized with a rhythm she could not name. Clara fell to her knees, gripping the edges of a stretcher, realizing with an icy certainty that the dead were not merely memories. They were an active force, bound by trauma and the unresolved horror of war. They demanded recognition, demanded that she witness their suffering, that she participate in a ritual of remembrance that defied logic and reason. Her eyes darted to the radio transmitter left in the corner of the tent, a relic of communication meant to bridge distances, now seemingly vibrating in sympathy with the spectral presence. The lines between the living and the dead blurred further, as though every heartbeat, every breath, every whispered word contributed to a larger, inexorable narrative that she was powerless to alter. A sudden, sharp cry pierced the night, and the figures in the tent lurched forward, not in menace, but with a desperation that was almost palpable. Clara's own voice caught in her throat as she realized she was part of a scene larger than herself, a nexus where past wounds, unfinished stories, and human fragility intersected. The whispers had grown louder still, no longer separate voices but a collective entity, guiding her movements, shaping her actions, and embedding a singular, terrifying truth into her consciousness. The battlefield did not release its dead, and the nurse who healed them could never truly leave. The night deepened, and Clara's exhaustion was no shield against the horrors that crept upon her. The tent, once a sanctuary of makeshift care, now felt like a cage built from shadows and whispers. Figures moved at the edge of her vision, pale shapes in tattered uniforms, faces twisted by agony she could feel but not see clearly. Each step she took seemed mirrored by invisible feet, echoing in time with the irregular pulse of her own heartbeat. The whispers had grown into voices, some soft, some harsh, all insistent, telling her of injuries, betrayals, and fears she had tried to bury alongside her patients. She approached a stretcher, her hands trembling over the form of a young soldier whose wounds were raw and festering. The candlelight flickered violently, and for a moment the boy's eyes opened wide, unearthly, distant, and a cold hand seemed to brush her arm. Clara recoiled, stumbling backward, heart hammering in terror. The whispers became a chorus, 1,000 voices overlapping. "You left us. Remember us. Save us." Their tone was not accusatory alone, it was urgent, demanding recognition of their suffering. Each syllable sank into her chest like lead, pressing on her lungs, making it almost impossible to breathe. Outside, the distant sound of artillery was replaced by something more subtle, a low murmur that echoed across the field, an invisible march of the dead. Clara caught glimpses of movement beyond the canvas, hands reaching through mud, feet dragging through the waterlogged trenches, faces twisted in silence. The boundary between living and dead had begun to dissolve, each shadow in the tent a potential fragment of a soul long gone, yet somehow present. Every object, bandages, instruments, even the scattered medical charts, seemed to quiver, alive with a resonance she could not name. She turned to the radio transmitter, its static now alive with whispered names and events, detailing injuries that had not yet occurred, predicting her reactions to those she had already treated. It pulsed in tandem with her fear, each flicker and hum sending shivers along her spine. Her vision blurred, reality folding over itself. Soldiers she had healed days before appeared before her, not as memories, but as living reminders of the pain that lingered. Their eyes, empty yet pleading, followed her every motion. Clara realized the dead were not merely specters, they were actors in a play of fate, with her as both audience and participant. In desperation, Clara moved to the center of the tent, closing her eyes, trying to steady her breathing. Yet even in darkness, the whispers persisted, now accompanied by a cold pressure on her shoulders, an invisible weight she could not shake. One voice, clearer than the rest, spoke directly into her mind. "Clara, you cannot leave. You are part of us, forever," she gasped, stumbling into the wall of the tent, hands gripping canvas that felt thicker than fabric, almost like skin. The air grew dense, oppressive, as if the tent itself were expanding, stretching into a vast chamber filled with wailing figures, each waiting for acknowledgement, each demanding her presence. Hours seemed to stretch into eternity. Every attempt to focus on her duties, bandaging, comforting, recording, was thwarted by the relentless presence around her. The living soldiers looked to her with a mixture of fear and trust, oblivious to the shadowy audience observing her every move. And then she heard it, a single, low, guttural sound that didn't belong to any living throat, a moan of despair that grew into a chorus of unbearable intensity. Clara fell to her knees, pressing her face into her hands, feeling the invisible gaze of countless eyes, the touch of phantom hands, and the unshakable certainty that the war she had thought was behind her had invaded her very soul. As the candle flickered one last time before guttering, Clara Henderson realized she had crossed a threshold. The dead were no longer passive reminders. They were a force, patient, watching, entwining their fate with hers. She was trapped between life and memory, between duty and terror, and the night stretched on with the promise that the living could not ignore the dead. Her hands, trembling and stained, clutched the edges of the stretcher as the shadows advanced ever closer, whispering her name with insistent reverence. The tent quivered under the weight of silence and whispers alike. Clara's exhaustion had long surrendered to raw, unrelenting terror. The shadows pressed closer, coiling around her legs, crawling along the canvas walls, and reaching toward her with hands she could not see but could undeniably feel. The whispers intensified, no longer fragmented phrases but a continuous, suffocating chant. "Clara, you cannot leave. You are ours. You must remember. You must save." Her pulse raced, each beat echoing through her skull, a frantic drum signaling her own helplessness against the unyielding presence that filled the tent. A sudden cry, human, yet impossibly distorted, pierced the air. Clara turned, eyes wide, to see Thomas, the young soldier, suspended unnaturally above his stretcher. His limbs twitched as if controlled by invisible strings. His lips moved soundlessly, forming words she could not hear, yet the urgency in his expression spoke volumes. She lunged forward instinctively, gripping his shoulders, but her hands passed through him as though he were made of mist. The candlelight flickered violently, casting grotesque shapes on the walls, hundreds of pale faces, some screaming silently, some staring with hollow eyes, all converging toward her. Clara felt herself shrinking, as if the shadows sought to engulf not only her body but her very essence. Outside, the battlefield's distant artillery had fallen silent, replaced by a new, more intimate horror, the sound of footsteps circling the tent. Clara realized with a jolt that the figures she had seen outside, the dead soldiers, mutilated and hollow-eyed, had entered, though no canvas flap had moved, no sound had announced their arrival. They surrounded her, their forms barely perceptible but undeniably present. A cold touch brushed her neck, and she gasped, stumbling backward. Her knees hit the wet, mud-stained ground, but the pressure of unseen hands continued to pin her in place. Each whisper now sounded like a command, each movement of the shadows a prelude to something inevitable and inescapable. Clara's mind spun with desperation. She remembered the injured she had saved, the men who had trusted her hands with their lives, and the countless others who had perished despite her best efforts. The dead were speaking not just to her, but through her, demanding acknowledgment, demanding that she bear witness, demanding that she carry the memory of every life they had lost. Her own hands moved against her will, lifting bandages, adjusting stretchers, performing the care of the living while haunted by the ever-present gaze of those who could not rest. The tent had become a liminal space, a bridge between the realm of the living and the dead, with Clara trapped as both guardian and captive. A shrill, otherworldly scream rent the air, forcing Clara to her knees again. Shadows pooled beneath the candle, twisting into shapes both familiar and alien. Faces of soldiers she had treated emerged from the darkness, their eyes wide, mouths forming silent pleas, accusing her of failures she could not remember committing. She felt the weight of countless lives pressing upon her shoulders, each one a ghostly burden, each one tethering her more firmly to the world of the departed. Her throat tightened, every breath a struggle against the invisible pressure that seemed determined to crush her spirit. And then came the moment Clara understood fully. The war had never truly ended. The battlefield had not released its dead, and she, who had tried to save them, had become a conduit for their unrest. The whispers, the shadows, the unearthly presence surrounding her, they were neither vengeance nor plea alone. They were a demand: witness, remember, endure, and never forget. The candle guttered violently, plunging the tent into near darkness, leaving only the faint glow of spectral eyes and the soft, insistent chanting that promised no reprieve. Clara Henderson's world had been irrevocably altered. The night stretched infinitely, and there was no hope that dawn could undo what had been awakened. Dawn never came that day, or perhaps it did and Clara could not see it. The candle had long since burned down to a stub, leaving only the dim, ghostly light that seemed to emanate from the shadows themselves. The tent was no longer a mere shelter but a threshold, a conduit for the restless dead who now moved freely among the living. Clara's body ached, her muscles cramped from hours of tension, yet she could not stop. She was caught in a rhythm dictated by the dead. Tend, witness, endure. Every breath she drew carried the cold, metallic tang of fear and the undeniable presence of lives unclaimed by death's mercy. She moved through the tent, checking the stretchers, whispering soft words of reassurance to the soldiers who slept fitfully, their faces pale and drenched in sweat. Yet even as she worked, the dead pressed closer, their forms more solid now, some barely translucent, some fully corporeal, their hollow eyes locked on her, their murmurs growing louder, more insistent. Clara realized that her every action was watched, judged, and mirrored by the departed. Each movement of her hands, each step she took, was part of a ritual she had never agreed to, but one she could not refuse. The very air vibrated with a hum of countless unseen presences, the collective weight of pain, fear, and unfinished business pressing upon her chest. A sudden shift startled her. A figure emerged from the corner of the tent, unmistakably one of the soldiers she had treated earlier in the week. His face was pale, eyes hollow, yet in them burned a desperation so intense that Clara felt it pierce her very soul. "You cannot leave us!" His voice was distant, echoing as if carried across a vast, empty space. The whispers now coalesced into a single unyielding command. She must remember, she must witness, she must bear the burden of their suffering. Panic surged, but her body moved as though in autopilot, guided by some unseen force to tend to the wounded, to acknowledge the dead, to fulfill her inescapable role. Outside the tent, the world had become a blur of mist and mud. Shadows moved with intent, creeping closer, circling the canvas walls, spilling into the corners of her vision. Clara could feel their presence in her bones, cold and insistent, guiding her, pressing her toward understanding. She realized the war had extended beyond time, beyond death. It lingered in her consciousness, in the air, in every whisper and shadow. Even if she fled, the dead would follow, tethered to her by the very compassion and care she had once offered. The battlefield had claimed more than flesh. It had claimed her psyche, intertwining her life irrevocably with the souls who could not rest. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes, but when Clara finally dared to lift her gaze, the tent was empty of living soldiers. Only the shadows remained, more defined than ever, their eyes fixed on her. The whispers had ceased, replaced by a suffocating silence that carried the weight of uncounted deaths. Clara sank to her knees, gripping the mud-stained ground, exhausted, terrified, yet oddly resolute. She understood, at last, that she could not undo what had begun. The dead were everywhere, and she was their witness, their caretaker, their unwilling sentinel. As she struggled to her feet, the first faint light of dawn, or some false semblance of it, crept through the torn canvas. The figures began to fade, retreating slowly, leaving her alone in the tent, trembling and hollow-eyed. But in the air a lingering murmur remained, faint yet unmistakable. "Clara, we are always here, waiting." The words wrapped around her mind like chains. She understood, with a clarity that chilled her blood. Even beyond this night, even beyond the battlefield, the war would never release her, and the dead would never abandon their watch. Clara Henderson rose, stepping out into the foggy field. The world seemed ordinary once more, yet she knew it had changed forever. Every shadow might conceal a soul she had tended, every whisper of wind a call from those who had not moved on. The nurse who had sought only to heal had become bound to the war in a way no living being could escape. And as the fog thickened around her, the faintest sound reached her ears, a whisper of her own name, carried on a voice that was both distant and unbearably close. Clara shivered. The night was over, But the haunting had only just begun.